It's Mark and Pete.
This week's colourful conversation with Mark and Pete is living below the poverty line. The United Kingdom has several anti-poverty strategies and has often focused on specific groups, for example, children or pensioners. But what are the root causes of poverty? How do we even measure the levels of poverty? What is abject poverty to some people, or maybe standard living to others? So, for example, it is noted that 1 in 5 people are living below the poverty line today in the United Kingdom. However, new data released by the Department of Work and Pensions show that the number of people living in the United Kingdom in relative poverty has actually risen over the past 2 years. There are now 10.6 million people in relative poverty, which is actually up from the 9.7 million in 2012. In 2014, another report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies said that 23.2% of Britons are now in relative poverty. That is the highest point since 2001. So here we are in 2015. With me today is Pete. Pete, what is poverty and why are we becoming poorer?
Well, to me, poverty is when you don't have enough income or access to things such as food and water and a roof over your head, by which I mean enough shelter such that you can sleep safely through the night. And, to me, that's basic definition of poverty is when you just don't have those things, either through too low an income or you don't have access to them for other reasons, maybe due to people being prejudiced against you and not selling to you and that sort of thing. So poverty to me is just not having the basic requirements for existence.
Yes, but it does seem that the statistics show that Britain in particular seems to be at a much growing and wider divide than we were in the past. So essentially that the poor are becoming poorer and the rich are becoming richer. And although you say that it's possible that people are finding that times are tough because job situation may be vulnerable, and perhaps that people are finding it difficult to meet the general standards of living. But here's a quick poem, which is my take on the matter, which really sort of reflects what I see as the Great British Divide. Town versus country, the pauper to the crown, the upper-class gentry to those lower down. A country cast in contrast from poverty to the rich, the suave tailor-made suits to those without a stitch, from run-of-the-mill hill to the money-made fair, the broke and the bankrupt to the wealthy billionaire, the joy-riding jokers to the jolly jet-setters, from the fine art collector to the downbeat debtor, Primark to Prada, Ford to Ferrari, a half-day in Cleethorpes to holidays on safari, food banks to Harrods, urban graffiti to the Times, at the bottom of the ladder through higher social climes, jelly deals to lobster thermidor, Kinder Egg to Fabergé. For those lucky and privileged, life is just a cabaret.
Yes. Oh, I thought you were going to burst into song there.
Nearly. I can if you wish.
No. Interesting that, there is such a division, isn't there, between rich and poor. Now, I've just recently moved from London, but I think London, along with all the great cities, but it seems particularly pronounced in London, the rich and the poor live right next to each other. You can wander from a place where there's huge, great mansions to an area where there's affordable housing and social problems, and just within a few yards on the same street. In fact,
yes.
Where I used to live. I'll leave listeners to guess which section I lived in, but it's interesting that we become inured to it, become used to such a status of the being rich and the being poor. But I mean, should there be poor? Shouldn't we be doing something about it?
Yes. Well, it's interesting that the UK government have a particular way of defining what they see as poverty in common usage. They've actually come up with a new set of categories. So the way it works is abject and absolute poverty, relative poverty, and social exclusion. So just to define, so absolute poverty, those are the ones defined as the lack of sufficient resources with which to meet the basic needs. But relative poverty defines income or resources in relation to the average. And it is concerned, for example, with the absence of the material needs to participate in, say, sort of general accepted daily life. The new category is what they call social exclusion. Now, this is a term coined by the UK government and is basically a shorthand for what can be the areas of individuals who suffer from a combination of, say, unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing maybe, or even on crime environments, bad health and family breakdowns. So that's the way that they tend to position it in the UK. But I guess that from most people's point of view is, well, where do you actually sit? If you benchmark yourself in these categories, you then have to say, well, that's still a little bit ephemeral. Does that really mean that I'm either in a relative poverty category or absolute or even social exclusion? It seems a little bit woolly to me.
It does seem a little bit woolly. And the problem that I find is if you set what you call the poverty line too high, then what you're doing is reducing in the eyes of many the severity of the problem. Fair enough, social exclusion is a bad thing. It should be addressed. But personally, I don't think you should call that poverty. I mean, you should just be careful with your terms. I know poverty can mean lack of anything, and I'm used to pointing out that the fact that material wealth doesn't necessarily mean you're rich. So lack of material wealth, in that sense, doesn't mean that you're poor, because you can be spiritually rich. Yes. However, when we talk about poverty and we talk about people being poor, usually we mean people who lack material things that they need to exist, as I was saying earlier. And so I think that this smearing out where the line is, this woolliness that you referred to, having a grey area, are you poor or not, means that you can argue that we're doing very well when you're not. You by not having a real hard line. No, this means being poor, and it really, people know that means that you are poor and that you're struggling to eat enough to survive. Then that means that people need to address it, and they'll believe you when you say that there are more people who are poor. Now the problem is, if you can increase the poverty line such that there are more people who are poor, then you can decrease it and make there be less. So suddenly you can manipulate the data, and to me it makes the problem more difficult to solve if you're a little bit vague as to what exactly is poor, and if you're not fitting in with what people generally mean. If you want to deal with things such as social exclusion, use different words.
Yes, exactly. Well, interestingly enough, there is actually a poverty and social exclusion project, which is actually set up by the government. And they do cite some rather alarming statistics, which gives a little bit more context. So they say that, for example, 500,000 children in the UK live in families who cannot afford to feed them properly. Now, that in itself is a bit worrying, but what they mean by properly, I suspect that will probably mean that it doesn't provide them with the ample and sufficient foods to keep them in a healthy way. They also talk about housing. So apparently 18 million people cannot afford adequate housing today. And it's also seen that 12 million people are too poor to engage in general common social activities. And even to the point where 5.5 million adults go without essential clothing, which is even more worrying, particularly in times where you have winters and cold, people who just simply don't have sufficient clothing to keep themselves warm. But that's all very well about statistics. But why is this situation happening? What is actually causing us to become poorer?
Well, I'm going to come out with a suggestion here that I think that the whole way of dealing with the poor, with the problem of the poor, is flawed in concept. In that, what we really need is to have the principle that one of the principles that we and Mark and Pete are always talking about, Mark, and that is localism. The reason why localism is important in so many areas of public life is that when they're done locally, you can assess how well they're being done. You can call people to account if they're doing them wrongly, but also you're aware of the issues and you're more likely to want to help. So, for example, if people are poor within your neighbourhood, as in your next door neighbour is poor, or if people in your family are poor, you've got a connection there. You have a motivation to do something about it. However, the principle that's often articulated in this country, in Britain, and if you're listening in America, my impression is that much the same attitude prevails, but maybe you can correct me in a tweet or two if that's the case. I'm sure you will. But in Britain, certainly the case that the assumption is the government should be doing something about this. Why are the poor people? Why isn't the government doing something about it? And I heard an interesting short speech by the MEP Daniel Hannan in the European Union Parliament only the other day. I heard it on YouTube. I wasn't in the European Parliament, but he said that giving, like giving to charity, and he was talking about giving to charitable projects to help poor people, but in far-flung places. And he was saying, well, it makes you feel better to say that we're going to give money, but if you're in government, what you're actually giving is other people's money, because you're giving money that's been raised by taxation, or in the case of the European Union, taken as contributions from countries who have themselves raised money by taxation. He said it actually feels even better if you put your hand in your own pocket and give yourself. And he was actually going and helping people, not simply paying, but going and helping people. And he'd taken part in such a scheme, I think, with one of the other MEPs there. And I think he hit on something there, in that when you talk about localism being a good solution, if you make it really local so that it's so local it's personal, then you're in a position to help people, to see the results of the help that you give, and to notice whether it's been effective. As soon as it's removed and given to a national government or a city council or a borough council, then it's one step removed from you, and you can always blame someone else. So people slip through the gaps and get left. And so I think that changing the whole way we deal with the poor is the only way, really, to ensure that the poor are looked after properly. I mean, Jesus in the Bible is quoted as saying, "You will always have the poor with you." So there will always be people who are poor, and I think that that's true. There are always going to be people who've dropped below this line, but our job is to help them, and to help them personally. If it was seen as a personal responsibility, in just quoting the Bible again, Galatians chapter 2, verse 10, the Apostle Paul, one of the early Christian leaders, speaking about what the church required of him to do, or required him to teach others to do as well. He said all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I've been eager to do all along. Remembering the poor is seen as a primary Christian virtue. In the context, that was talking about the one thing that everyone had to do. You are, in terms of Christian theology, we would say you are saved solely by the grace of God. But then what are you meant to do? Well, about the first thing you're meant to do, you are to remember to do in serving God, is to remember the poor. So this is a primary concern. So theologians and Bible scholars are known to say this. Some people argue with it, but it's often said that God, from studying the Bible, appears to have a bias. He's biased, even though it says he's impartial everywhere. If he does have a bias, it's towards the poor. And so I think that we are to remember the poor. Here's one reference. There are many references I could have come up with. Deuteronomy 15, verse 8. be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. And the them in that case is someone among you who is poor. So I think if we had that principle, then we wouldn't have people who dropped through the support mechanism that's put in place, because they'd be people we knew about and were expecting to help. However, we can't just change the whole way, even if that were the end in view. We couldn't change the whole way that we think, the whole way we deal with the poor overnight. So that's not really a realistic solution, certainly not in the short term, maybe in the long term or the extra long term, but certainly not in the short term. So the question is, what do we do about it now? What is the right way to deal with poverty, acknowledging the situation that we have at the moment?
Yes. And it's interesting that from the point of view that you mentioned about localism, I mean, this is quite important, because in order to understand the issues, we have to also understand what's on our doorstep. It isn't a simple case of just looking at money, for example. We also have to look at poverty in a wider scale. For example, as we've said, we have to look at the effects of housing. Education is another point, the point of culture. But just sort of looking at it on a larger scale, so this is beyond United Kingdom. So the United Nations, the UN, back in 2000, had a particular goal. And for this particular 21st century, the aim was to halve the global proportion of absolute poor people by 2015. Well, here we are in 2015, and at the time, although that they had a particular target, they had a particular measure, and that says anyone living on an income of less than $1 a day. Well, interestingly, they've actually upped that figure, and the criterion has been moved upwards in response to new data about prices and purchasing power to $1.25. So essentially what they've actually assessed is that 1.2 billion people on this planet still live below the 1.25 threshold. That's quite interesting.
Yes, I mean, that's quite a low amount, of course. That's US dollars, $1.25 a day, is a low amount for us living here. I guess what they're talking about in purchasing power, in some parts of the world, that does buy you enough to live on, I guess. But extreme poverty being that amount, it's interesting that I was reading earlier that China has used a different definition, and their definition ends up with the poverty line of absolute poverty being approximately 99 cents a day. That's at the same time as the United Nations having their level of 125 a day. So why Chinese poor people are poorer than others? Now, why is that the case? Well, their reasoning, now, they say, this is the Chinese government's line on this, they're saying that they've arrived at this amount by the calorie intake that this allows. So they're not defining it necessarily in terms of the things that you mentioned, like education, etc. They're defining it by how much you get to eat. And if you've got enough calories, then you're okay. So I mean, maybe that's a very basic definition. Doesn't take into account what vitamins you're having, I suppose. But it's a way of measuring whether you've got enough to eat. And they set it lower. But that was an increase. They increased it in 2008.
Yes.
I think that was, 2008. They increased it. So before they had a lower definition. But what they increased was the calorie intake that they expected. Now that's interesting that they should have that definition. And I just mentioned that so that in saying that you've got just about enough calories to live on. That's not the same definition we're talking about when we say people are in poverty in Britain.
Exactly.
I know I said sort of glibly, well, poor people in China are poorer, but they're so poor that they're not even, they're going to die from not having enough food. Whereas in Britain, we're going to say you're poor because you're not getting the right mix of vitamins and protein. You're not having a balanced diet, but you are having enough calories just to stay alive. So this is where it becomes difficult, because you say, there are many poor people in this country. We should stop helping people, for example, in China or other countries in the world, because there are so many poor people here. But are there poor people poorer? I mean, it just makes it so difficult to assess.
Yes. Well, it is, but I mean, take for example in Britain, and I think it's widely known that we have a welfare state, and we have had since the 1940s. And of course, this is something that we, as the generations following that period, have grown up with. But in recent times, due to the economy, that the social welfare has actually been cut quite dramatically. And often people have cited that the cut in welfare, particularly in Britain I'm talking about, means that they are pushed further into debt, whether that's through the lack of money or even through housing problems. And so effectively this leaves people powerless to challenge incorrect decisions that are made from them because they've been effectively nurtured into this society of this welfare state.
Yes. Yes. Becoming reliant on handouts is a problem. And again, I go back to what I was saying earlier, the principle that we are, Mark and Peter, are often banging on about, localism. If you get away from the idea that all the problems of poverty are going to be handled by the welfare state, by the state, then you're going to start to take responsibility yourself. Now, people do this already. I'm not saying that people don't care for each other. Of course they do. And there are many voluntary organisations which assist in this, including the churches around the country. But there's still the idea that it's not our responsibility personally because we've got this welfare state. And, the welfare state was set up with good intentions. But what it's done is it's taken people's sense of responsibility for the poor away from them, and for people who regard themselves as poor. You were saying earlier, Mark, about where we regard ourselves in this spectrum. Are you actually poor? If you regard yourself as poor, do you think that the government is to blame because they're not giving you enough? Or is there some responsibility for you to get yourself out of it? Now, there'd be a mixture of responses to that. But there's certainly been a big issue with what you might call entitlement syndrome. I'm entitled to live as well as someone who has an excellent job, even though I haven't got a job. And the problem with that, although that seems great and it's being true to the principle of equality, it's actually not fair. It's unfair that someone who has a great job is not paid more or doesn't have a better standard of living than someone who is not doing that job. Yes. I mean, whether you could do the job or not, the fact is that you don't have it, and therefore you shouldn't be paid for it. It's unfair, even if it would be equal. And the principles of communism, where people are paid because of their need, or a principle other than whether they actually earn it, has been shown to be ineffective in producing a society which produces wealth, which increases in wealth, which produces goods which produce wealth, which produces a culture in which people are trying to achieve and thus are able to come up with innovative ways of creating wealth. Just doesn't happen when there's always the chance that you can fall back on the state to help you. And the state, in that case, of course, which gains its wealth from its people, gets poorer, and it eventually becomes untenable. And that was the problem in the Soviet Union. And with widespread use of social welfare benefits across the European Union, the European Union governments are becoming poorer and poorer. Yes. In terms of the money they can spend on their population. I'm not talking about their individual salaries. They appear to be going up, but that's a subject for another day. So, this idea, it seems uncaring to say, but the welfare state, as we have it set up, has contributed, I believe, to the increase in poverty, because it has encouraged an entitlement syndrome, which of course not all people have, and there are many people who are just struggling and working hard to try and get out of out of their problems of poverty. Yes, of course that's true, but just speaking across the board generally, if we didn't have this welfare system, this safety net for people, you wouldn't have the same number of people trapped in poverty. But you need to counter that also, the personal responsibility for the people who are poor, with the personal responsibility of the people who are not poor to help them at an individual level.
Yes.
Because if you don't have both, then it's not going to work. You need both for it to work. You need everyone to take individual responsibility.
I agree about the social welfare, and I think that that's something that clearly needs to be defined. But taking social welfare aside, one of the other points about poverty has been around work. I take the point that you have to take your initiative. Everybody has to contribute to society. One of the challenges, particularly in Britain, and in fact has been debated throughout Europe, has been about the minimum wage, because the criticism there has been about exploitation, i.e. one of the reasons, particularly in Britain, has been the criticism that the wealthier are getting wealthier because they're exploiting those further down the chain. Now, of course, as we know, we've got laws in place, i.e. a framework of system in business, which says that if you are going to contribute a skill, a service, you will be paid a minimum wage. However, with that said, it is a challenge where inflation and that being also market forces has meant that people, even though they may be doing a full-time job, still on a minimum wage cannot afford the basic household needs and services that they need to keep themselves off the poverty line. So that can often be a challenge in itself.
Yes.
So simply, what is fair in society, i.e. even in business, as to what you would pay somebody so that they can live a sensible life.
I mean, the problem with the minimum wage, having a minimum wage set, is you're undermining the free market ideal of being able to have as an employer and employee a contract between the two of you that the two of you work out. So as soon as there's a minimum wage in place, immediately you don't have the freedom to set the rate between the two of you. As soon as this happens, this means that if you can't set a low enough rate for you to be able to afford to employ the worker, then as an employer, you're simply not going to employ them. And so the person goes from having a job that doesn't pay enough to not having a job, or they never get it in the first place. And this is a conundrum. I don't see a solution to it other than not having a minimum wage.
Well, actually, what's happening in Britain, interestingly, is that in the last 10 years, more people are having more than one job in order to make ends meet. So, for example, somebody who might be, say, in their 30s or 40s, who has possibly got 20 years experience, if you were to compare where they were, say, 20 years ago, they would have had a full-time job and that would have met their needs. Whereas today, a large percentage of people are having to have more than one job to still meet the same standards that they had 10 or 20 years ago.
Yes, I accept that those statistics are there, but I believe that the evidence, the evidence of employment, looking at employment statistics over the past few years, shows that actually increasing the minimum wage it decreases employment of low-skilled or workers with low pay. The numbers of people actually employed is decreased. So although it does mean that in poor times people will have to take more than one job, that's a problem. But if you increase the minimum wage, that means all jobs, the number of jobs available, will reduce, and so less people are employed at all. So the problem is not the minimum wage. The problem is the lack of wealth creation. The problem is one of encouraging wealth creation by these entrepreneurs, and in enforcing upon them a minimum wage, especially entrepreneurs setting up new ventures, probably small companies, they're just not going to be able to do it. You may even stop the company actually being formed in the first place. So, although it seems harsh, I feel that the minimum wage itself is a bad policy.
Yeah, And I think that to follow our viewpoint on localism, our solution very much is to invest in the local community, to encourage small and medium-sized companies and even large companies to nurture the talent that's in those local communities, because in turn that would prosper for those people in a given community. It would encourage people to take employment. In turn, that would give and spur effectively a better society for people. People can afford then to feed themselves, to get off the poverty line, to be able to get into housing, better housing, and take more control. Whereas at the moment, there are a large number of people who are falling below that what I'll call that common line, where they cannot anymore fend for themselves, and they're either living on the streets or, unfortunately, they're just perishing.
Yes, I think that's right. That if companies were to source and employ locally, they would have a great benefit, because as they are regarded as an employer for the community, people will want to support them. It works both ways. And in having a culture of people who love to work for that company, you have a ready pool of unskilled labour at least. Sure, for many professionals, you're going to have to go further afield, but as locally as possible, if you can source people and resources in that way, then you're going to benefit both the company and the local economy and the society in which the company is placed. Whereas if you, as many companies in Britain, speaking of my experience in Britain here, I don't know what it's like in the US and other countries, but in Britain certainly there's a trend for companies to say that they contribute to society by giving money that isn't theirs. For example, you go into a supermarket and they sometimes will say, would you like to contribute some of your shopping to these poor people? Then they go and give your shopping to those poor people.
Yes.
And then say that they've done it. And various sort of initiatives like that, which can then be used to say it's a caring company. Well,
yes.
They'd be better off simply being part of the economy in that local area and employing people, and thus allowing them to get out of the poverty trap by working their way out of it, rather than giving money, which, as I say, certainly in that scheme that I just talked about, doesn't belong to the company in the first place.
Yes. And interestingly on that point is that there is a growing number of food banks, which as a charitable cause is a worthy one, but is not a sustainable solution, to your point, which is that we need to take ownership, we need to have that localism, we need to have that investment. So with that in mind, I'll open it up to the listeners and ask them, where do you see your country? Do you believe that the great divide is there in your nation? Do you believe that we are now seeing more people living below the poverty line? We welcome your views. So join us again next time for more colourful conversations with Mark and Pete.